In this episode, we're going to be looking at a ton of cavalry testing and tactics, starting with cavalry only and moving on to cavalry versus foot troops. Let's get started. For the first matchup, we will look at line formation on hold position. Interestingly enough, once the two lines meet, they pass right through each other with very little friction. Some casualties come from the initial charge, but they mostly come from hand-to-hand combat while not moving. The side on hold ground gets stomped, which we can see is supported by the data and several runs. Holding ground nets 0.25 KDR and a 0% win rate. The true mirror matchup, line charge versus line charge. This time we see a much more violent clash, with most units running into an enemy and stopping while some pass right through and cycle charge back to the mob. Again, not many casualties on the initial clash, but really pick up steam once in melee combat without moving. It's neck and neck right to the very end, which we expected. However, we do see some interesting data with one side winning more than the other. In my observation, the side that sticks together closer for the melee combat will win more often, so cycle charging is not good in cavalry versus cavalry tactics. When using advanced command, we see in the past a pullback from the main battle, which is demonstrated even more when on horseback. The casualties quickly pile up and advanced line is routed easily. The data is very similar to line hold with only 0.29 KDR and 0% win rate. Looking at the commands for line formation, charge seems to be the only viable option. Using advanced helps keep the unit cohesion, but be sure to use charge before they reach the enemy line. I don't think I've ever used shield wall for cavalry before, so I had no idea what to expect here. We see a similar pattern with a weak initial hit from the charge and most of the enemy passing through the lines. However, once the general melee starts, we see the shield wall formation dominating the fighting. It turns into a bit of a slog, but shield wall still comes out on top. The data is clear. Shield wall is far superior than line when holding position at 1.4 KDR and 100% win rate. Shield wall has a tighter formation, which I suspect is helping in melee. Giving the charge command in shield wall produces some unexpected results. It seems they act the same as line formation, blowing past the enemy and coming back for melee. It's a much closer battle this time with only a slight edge for the shield wall. The KDR is much closer to 1 this time at 1.24, but still maintains a 100% win rate. Some interesting results here. I can't recall ever using advanced formation and it performing well in melee combat, but it seems to be slightly better in this case of shield wall for cavalry. Interestingly enough, we see a 1.27 KDR and 100% win rate, which is on par with charge. I did not expect that. Shield wall was certainly a nice surprise with each formation performing well, but hold ground performing the best. It might be a viable option to ride up to the enemy in shield wall formation, halt, and bait them into attacking you. As you can probably tell at this point, the formations that keep cavalry close to one another work best, and those that spread them out perform poorly. Loose formation drives this point home, with hold ground getting crushed. At 0.17 KDR and 0% win rate, it's not recommended to use. Charge formation seems to perform a little bit better as it forces each unit to seek out the nearest enemy, causing them to bunch up. It's a fairly close fight, but the initial separation is enough to cause a loss with each fight. At 0.87 KDR and 0% win rate, it's certainly better than holding ground, but still should be avoided. I really like advanced loose formation for cav versus cav battles. It lays down a cool looking pattern that the enemy has to weave through, drastically slowing down their advance. The only downside is you won't have any units left to fight with. It's just something to consider. We see a 0.22 KDR and 0% win rate here, which is on par with expectations. The recap is easy. Don't use loose formation with cavalry facing other cavalry. None of these were acceptable, and you're better off using something else. At first I thought about skipping circle and square formation testing, but I'm glad I didn't. Hold formation is a mess since half or less of the circle is engaged in melee, giving the enemy a huge advantage. It's not pretty. 0.63 KDR and 0% win rate. Charging the circle looks pretty cool at least. More importantly, we see the units packed fairly close together, giving a slight advantage in melee. That holds through to the end. We end up with a 1.46 KDR and 100% win rate, which is on par with shield wall holding firm. Circle advance took a really long time to test. It's not a good formation to fight in, but can be useful if you just need to delay the enemy as long as possible for other maneuvers. We see a 0.73 KDR and 0% win rate, so it's not the most useful. The real use for circle formation would be a compact unit that can charge an enemy, then fend off against arrows when stationary. It performed better than line formation from holding ground and advancing, but still not good enough. I was expecting more of the same from square formation, but to my shock, we see it performing better when holding ground. It's still not great results, but better than most. We see a 1.43 KDR and 100% win rate, which is close to shield wall. Charge formation performs as expected with a nice early lead, which holds through to the end. There are some spots where the other side gets some good trades, but overall, square charge is quite good. At 1.58 KDR and 100% win rate, it's actually the best thus far. However, once we get to advanced formation, we see the same pattern emerge like before and leading to certain victory. At 0.84 KDR, it's far from the worst on the list, but still not usable at 0% win rate. I wasn't expecting this, but square formation is one of the best for cavalry versus cavalry fights, with both holding ground and charge working quite well. Now for the biggest shock of this guide, Skein formation. I don't want to spoil it any further, so let's watch. Holding ground with Skein is an interesting case because the two flanks are quite far from the main fighting, causing a big discrepancy in numbers in melee. We see one of the worst performances so far at 0.22 KDR and 0% win rate. Surely charge formation will be the salvation, right? After all, Skein formation was meant for cavalry charges. We see a fairly close battle with Skein pulling ahead slightly in the end. The dataset is small, but at 0.95 KDR and 50% win rate, it's on par with being in line formation. No surprise here, Skein Advance is trash and should not be used under any circumstances. At 0.29 KDR and 0% win rate, it's only slightly better than holding ground. When it comes to cavalry versus cavalry combat, Skein formation can be used when charging if you're okay with break-even results. Personally, I would avoid it as other options are much better. Before we do the full recap, let's look at a couple special uses of cavalry. These cataphracts have a spear that's long enough to be braced, making it an interesting counter to other cavalry units while on foot. We dismount our units and set them in a line formation. The initial charge, we see a huge success with nearly 30 kills and only 10 deaths or so, but the second charge hits from the back and more than makes up for it. It's not a pretty sight, and we lose with a 0.21 KDR. Now we dismount only 50 troops and position them in front of our cavalry, who are in shield wall formation. This will give a boost at the start, but also a decisive advantage in the melee from the formation. It's a convincing win at 1.83 KDR, which is the highest we've achieved thus far. Okay, one more, because I wasn't happy with how short the spear brace was. Now we place 100 troops to run the length of our cavalry. Holy moly, it's all green from the kill feed with a massive advantage on our side to start. The battle stays in our favor, and we can even remount the foot troops and combine them back afterwards. We squeeze out a tiny bit more KDR at 1.9, but fairly similar results to the previous. If you know where the enemy is going to charge you with cavalry, this setup can really make a huge difference. Now let's take a look at all the different formations and commands to get a sense of what we should be using and what to steer clear of. Let's start with the easy ones to eliminate. Don't use line, loose, or skein regardless of what commands are given, as each one results in very poor performance or at best break even. Shocking, I know. I used line and skein almost exclusively for my cavalry. Now for the winners. Any of the formations that force our cavalry into shield wall, which include shield wall, circle, and square formation, all performing well. Shield wall did well no matter which command was given, although holding ground performed the best. Circle formation only worked when using charge, and square did well as long as you did not use advance. Dismounting some of the cavalry for a spear brace line still performed the best though at 1.9 KDR. If you have the time to micro, it might be worth a shot. Here we go, the real reason everyone uses cavalry, to counter the cowardly archers. We're going to use a different format for the testing since we will generally encounter archers in two different formats, line and loose formation. We will also test the difference between bunching together or spreading them far apart. Up first, both sides will begin in line formation and bunched together. We see a massive list of casualties with each charge that passes through the archer line. There are a few casualties for the cavalry since a bunched up line of archers allows only a small fraction to shoot arrows. For the data, we are only looking at KDR since it's assumed that cavalry will beat archers every time. The question is, by how much? In this case, it's between 16 and 20 KDR. We will leave both sides in line formation but spread them out a lot. The initial charge is equally devastating as before, but notice the kill feed turns red as they turn and charge again. It's still an easy win for the cavalry, but they take many more casualties. Now the KDR drops to around 5, which is nearly 4 times less. With more archers able to shoot arrows, casualties begin to pile up for the cavalry. Now we spread the archers out but bunch up the cavalry. The casualties inflicted pile up with each row that passes, so it seems that more than just the first row or two can attack with charge. Notice how much red is in the kill feed this time though. There's a significant increase in cavalry being shot off their horses before and after the charge passes through the line. It's still a win, but a much costlier one. We see the KDR drop all the way down into the 2s. Ouch. For the last one, we switch it up. Archers are bunched up and cavalry spread wide. An interesting thing happens. The initial charge hits hard like usual, but the flanks start to fold in and charge the archers from the side, causing some damage but also stopping others from shooting arrows as they have to switch to melee mode now. We see very few casualties on the cavalry side, and it only gets worse with time. We see an incredible 20 to 31 KDR for this matchup. Let's look at the other common scenario, archers in loose formation. I've seen the AI use both, so we will run the same 4 tests again to see how each one holds up. We start with both sides bunched up in loose formation. The archers spread out quite a bit more, but after the first charge they clump up into a giant square and get slaughtered. There are a few more casualties from archer arrows, but for the most part it's a stomp. We see a KDR between 4 and 6 here, so not quite as good as both in line formation. With both sides spread out far, we see a huge list of casualties on the first charge, but also more cavalry being shot down with each charge. It's still heavily in favor of the cavalry though, which shows in the data at 4 KDR. Keeping the archers spread out but bunching the cavalry up, we start to see a battle that could almost swing in favor of the archers. The cavalry take heavy damage when facing away, but also when at very close range to the archers before they hit. It still results in a win, but at 1.6 KDR, it's not far from a defeat. This time, we keep the archers bunched up and spread the cavalry out. Once again, we start to see the flanks of the cavalry curl inward and run down the line, getting kills and switching archers into melee mode. There is almost a constant presence of cavalry within the archer line, which leads to a massive upset. The KDR for this setup is between 11 and 14 KDR, which is very impressive. The next test was more of a personal curiosity. We test with both lines spread out and issue the advance command. It seems like the archers do worse when they can't shoot arrows, and advance command keeps the cavalry stuck in the enemy line without cycle charging. It's an interesting battle with a bit of back and forth, but cavalry still hold the advantage to the end. The KDR is less than impressive, however, at 1.9 and is near the bottom of the list in terms of performance. For the final round of archer testing, we used loose formation for both cavalry and archers. My goal here was to try to minimize casualties from arrows with loose formation for our cavalry, but let's see what the numbers say. We start with both in loose formation and clumped together. It's interesting because there are still plenty of casualties to arrow volleys, but the casualties caused by the cavalry seem higher with more spread out formations from being in loose. The KDR ends up being between 5 and 6, which is quite a bit worse than the previous test using clumped formations. We see a similar pattern with both sides being spread out, although our cavalry seem to have too many on one flank and not enough on the other, causing an inefficient charge. I was able to get the line a bit longer the second time around, which shows in the data, between 4 and 9 KDR. It seems having enough length to cover the enemy line is key. In the next test, we see the same issue play out again with archers spread and cavalry clumped up. The cavalry clear out plenty of archers from the center, but take massive amounts of damage from both flanks. At 2.9 KDR, it's nearly twice as effective as when cavalry was in line formation though. Finally, we spread the cavalry wide and leave the archers grouped up tight. This time we watch from directly above and see how deadly those side flanks are. It's a masterful win at 14 KDR. Before we look at all the data combined, let's run a couple more experiments. It seems cavalry are very effective when charging, but lose some steam after the first charge. Once the first charge is done, we will allow our line to turn around and order them to dismount in the middle of the enemy formation. Now they fight on foot while outnumbering the enemy from both charges, but it seems the archers are putting up quite a fight. The battle's over quickly, but some casualties are taken. At 2.27 KDR, it's not a great option considering how good some of the other ones were. This time we split up into 2 groups and matched the line length of the enemy. This will cause less downtime between each charge and hopefully reduce casualties. The first line slams into the enemy with some effect, and the second line comes in shortly after, but it was not as effective. However, the second time around is very effective, and we see the archer lines quickly melt away to the constant pressure. The KDR boosts up to 5, which is pretty good, but I think we can improve further with a third line. Again, we try try to match their line's length and charge all three within a couple seconds between each hit. The first line is largely ineffective, but the second and third do a ton of damage. And what's even better, only moments after the third line finishes, the first line has already turned around and entering the archer line. It's a nearly constant stream of horses rushing through the enemy lines, causing a ton of damage. Adding a third line boosts the KDR up to 8.4, which is a huge improvement. Now let's look at all the data together and see what important patterns emerge. You'll notice there were quite a few more tests that I ran that did not make the video, mostly because they were awful. There's actually a way to lose 500 versus 500 using cavalry, and they both use advanced command. The best case scenario is when the enemy archers are in line formation and are not very spread out, which can lead to a KDR north of 15. What's more common though is the enemy in loose formation and spread out, in which we can see a slight edge to line formation. There are two things we can't see from the data, but I noted them down from watching all of these battles. First, archers that are spread out wide are harder to deal with for cavalry, and second, having our cavalry line as long as or longer than the enemy's archer line is critically important. So be sure to spread your archers out very wide when facing off against cavalry, and be sure to adjust your cavalry line before charging them in. I can already see it now. Tons of complaints asking why I didn't test other formations against archers. It actually didn't occur to me until I started writing the script, so I went back in to do a small scale test with a few formations to see if there was a big difference. We hold fire with the archers and see how many charge cycles it takes to knock each line out. Starting with line, we see a small number of casualties for the first couple of charges, but by the third charge we see a huge increase. By the fifth charge, the line is broken. Now for the winner of the cavalry versus cavalry testing, shield wall. We see a bigger increase on the first couple of charges, but a similar 5 charges in total to take them out. Loose starts off weak with only 2 casualties, but picks up some steam with each successive charge. By the 5th charge, there's a single troop left, but we'll make an exception and say 5 cycles. Now for most people's favorite, Skein formation. It seems like a similar pattern to all of the other formations, but with fewer casualties with each pass. Although this formation takes 6 passes to break. Oddly enough, Skein performed the worst out of all of them. For the final section, we will test cavalry versus a couple different types of infantry, starting with the Legionary. First, we will have the infantry hold their ground in line formation. They don't seem to be able to stop the charge whatsoever and take heavy casualties with each charge. We end up losing 5 cavalry, which resulted in a 97.8 KDR. I was not expecting these results considering how dominant Legionaries are. Now we give the Legionary the charge command and see how they fare. The first charge has no casualties with moderate casualties inflicted. But because the enemy is charging, the cavalry turn around too quickly and don't gain enough speed for an effective charge. They end up taking a few more cavalry out, but it's still a stomp at 16.6 KDR. Lastly, I wanted to see how charging into the circle formation the AI loves to use would work. It works quite well, it would seem. They don't really get any hits off with each charge, possibly because each unit is facing a different direction. I'm not sure, but it ain't pretty. We end up with 6 deaths, which is still in the 90 KDR range. It seems cavalry are the hard counter to Legionary. And finally, we look at a story of redemption. In the Shock Infantry Guide, we used the Menavliaton against Legionary and got stomped every time. We now pit the same cavalry against them to see how they hold up. Starting with hold ground, we see some disappointing results, although there's a bit more red mixed in with each charge. It seems holding ground isn't an option against cavalry with any melee unit. However, once we give the infantry a charge command, all hell breaks loose. Not only do the cavalry not have enough room to cycle charge effectively, but each pass allows the Menavliaton to catch up and pull more riders from their steed. The cavalry only managed 208 kills before breaking and losing everything. Finally, we find a use for the Menavliaton. Okay, here we go. We are hoping for some redemption for the Skein formation. The first pass is a positive trade. Then things turn ugly. It seems the Skein formation take a bit longer to turn around and our cav are sitting ducks. Only 170 kills this time. Please, stop using Skein formation with cavalry. Alright, it's time to pull out the tricks. We try the 2-line cavalry charge to see how they do. The first line trades evenly and the second line trades poorly. It just seems to go downhill from there though. The Menavliaton are very fast for foot infantry and can easily chase down cavalry that get stuck or slowed down on other cavalry. Now we are down to 158 kills. It's getting worse. It seems the best chance we have is to manually control the charge distance. Our cavalry get cut down easily when they make a short turn after each charge, so instead we instruct them further out each time. time. Even with controlling the charges, we are still losing more than we are taking out. It's not an easy battle. Finally, we get a great connection and take out a sizable chunk. This continues for several minutes and ultimately ends in a victory at 2.45 KDR. The biggest takeaway here is that cavalry must keep moving in order to be effective, so try your best to keep them from getting stuck inside enemy formations. Manually controlling them can help, or avoid sending them if you're not sure. If you're trying to deal with cavalry charges, then keep your shock troops towards the rear of your infantry formation and issue the charge command so they can catch the enemy cavalry when they get stuck or slow down. If you found any of this info useful, please hit the like button as it really would help me out a ton. Up next, we will be looking at archers and javelin cavalry. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.